Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Today we're going to be covering the Southern reaction to Reconstruction. Now that the slaves were freed, there were many challenges that they faced when it came to blending into society. Prior to Reconstruction, slaves could not get married. Now, these married couples could legalize their marriages in court. Families were torn apart at slave auctions, now put ads out in local newspapers trying to reunite with lost family members. Many of the free African Americans moved from predominantly white counties to places with more African Americans and those who shared their cultures. Now that the enslaved had been emancipated, some started to demand that they had the same economic and political rights and opportunity for land ownership just like their white counterparts. Since many of the newly freed excelled at farming, many former slaves wanted to own their own land to farm on. Many of the white planters refused to give up any of their plantations when General William T. Sherman issued Special Field Orders No. 15, which was a wartime order that gave newly freed slaves no more than 40 acres of land and a mule. After the Civil War, the government gave back the land to the planters that was taken by Order 15. Prior to the Civil War, there were slave codes that were put in place that limited the movement and success of any slave in the South. After the Civil War and the passing of the 13th Amendment, slavery was abolished. Southern states could no longer have slave codes, so they decided to create laws that limited the freed slaves in the South. They named them Black Codes. After Lincoln was assassinated and President Johnson took office, Johnson put his own Reconstruction plan into effect. Johnson had approved many new state legislatures in the South who began to pass the Black Codes that denied civil rights to freed African Americans. Every state in the South had passed these laws and greatly limited the freedom of freed blacks in the South, or freed slaves. The Black Codes led to strong opposition to President Johnson's plan for Reconstruction, and free African Americans everywhere organized to oppose the codes. Here is an edited example of one of the Black Codes. Now that the slaves have become emancipated, it is necessary to pass regulations that preserve public order. These regulations must also preserve the comfort and correct behavior of the former slaves. Therefore, the following rules have been adopted with approval of the United States military authorities who have commanded this area. Number 1. Every Negro is required to be in the regular service of some white person or former owner who shall be held responsible for the conduct of that Negro. Number 2. No public meetings or congregations of Negroes shall be allowed after sunset. Such public meetings may be held during the day with the permission of the local captain in charge of the area. Number 3. No Negro shall be permitted to preach or otherwise speak out to congregations of colored people without special permission in the writing from the government. Number 4. Negroes who may legally marry, own property, and sue and be sued in the court of law. Number 5. Negroes may not serve on juries. Number 6. A Negro may not testify against the white person in the court of law. Number 7. It shall be illegal for a Negro or a person of Negro descent to marry a white person. Number 8. No Negro shall be permitted outside in public after sundown without permission in writing from the government. A Negro conducting business for a white person may do so, but only under the direct supervision of his employer. Number 9. No Negro shall sell, trade, or exchange merchandise within this area without the special written permission of his employer. Number 10. No Negro is not allowed in the military service shall be allowed to carry firearms of any kind or weapons of any type without the special written permission of his employers. Those were the black codes that were set up in the South after slavery had ended. They replaced the slave codes. You can see that life in the South for a freed African American after the war was just like it was before the end of the war. They had heavy restrictions placed upon them. After the end of slavery and the implementation of the Military Reconstruction Acts, African Americans began to gain political power in southern states. In 1870, Hiram Revels, an African American man from North Carolina, became the Republican senator-elect from the state of Mississippi, the same state that elected Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. By the end of Reconstruction, there were nearly 100 African Americans elected to state legislatures in the South. Southern white Democrats believed that African Americans shouldn't hold any power in the United States. In 1866, 6 veterans of the Confederate Army from Tennessee created a hate group named the Ku Klux Klan, shortened to the KKK. The KKK was organized primarily as a reaction to these African Americans who were voted into positions of power. One of the most well-known early members of the KKK was the prominent Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest from Tennessee. The KKK was a secret society of members who wore masks to hide their identity, and they opposed civil rights, particularly suffrage for African Americans. They would use violence and intimidation that included massacres, lynching, rape, pillaging, and terror to attempt to control African Americans in the South. White supremacy ran rampant throughout the South, and local governments did very little to stop the violence. This could be because members of society like law enforcement, ministers, merchants, and military officers donned hoods, burned crosses, and murdered those who crossed their path. Congress had to pass laws that made it a federal crime to interfere with elections or to deny citizens equal protection under the law. Free African Americans began to see that this new world in Reconstruction looked much like the old world. Many whites tried to force these black Americans back to the plantations. In order to sidestep the 15th Amendment, white Southern Democrats instituted roadblocks against African American suffrage. New laws such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses were put in place to suppress African American voters in the South. What came to exist was a segregated society, even though it was not law, but turned into de facto segregation, or segregation by the fact that it merely exists. Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation in the United States that primarily affected Southern African Americans. The purpose of Jim Crow was to return Southern states to an antebellum class structure by marginalizing black Americans and black communities, and individuals that attempted to defy Jim Crow laws were often met with violence and death. The name comes from an insulting song lyric regarding black people. Jim Crow laws were put in place after Reconstruction fell in 1877 and lasted all the way until the mid-1960s, when the modern-day civil rights movement produced the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Some argue they were not extinguished until 1968. Many Southern Democrats tried to get the president to veto the 15th Amendment, and when that was not an option, they put different tactics into place to try and stop Southern free black men from practicing suffrage or voting. We're going to cover those now. These were the literacy tests, the poll taxes, and the grandfather clauses that I previously mentioned. The literacy tests. The Democrats passed voter qualification laws that mandated that a person had to read in order to vote. Most blacks were asked to read the Constitution. Considering that most had been slaves and were uneducated, they could not pass the test. This took away the rights of black Americans to vote. Poll taxes. The Democrats passed voter qualification laws that mandated that a person had to pay a $2 tax in order to vote. This was a lot of money for a newly freed slave, and most could not afford it. The third was the grandfather clause. The Democrats passed voter qualification laws that mandated that a person could only vote if their grandfather had been eligible to vote and had been a citizen. Since most slaves' grandfathers had also been slaves, they did not qualify to vote under these laws. These laws were specifically designed to take away the political power of blacks by taking away the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. This is known as attempting to disenfranchise black Americans. The word franchise means the right to vote, as does suffrage. To defranchise means to take away their right to vote. I'll see you next time.